first speaker is Federico Finchelstein, who is professor of history at the New School for Social Research and the Eugene Long College. He received his Ph.D. at Cornell University. Professor Finchelstein is the author of 7 books on fascism, 8 books on fascism, Populism, Dirty Wars, the Holocaust and Jewish history in Latin America and in Europe. His books have been translated into Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Chinese, Hungarian, Korean, and Turkish. His most recent book, the 8th, is The Wannabe Fascists, A Guide to Understanding the Greatest Threat to Democracy. He'll be followed by António Costa Pinto and Diana Garvin, and I will introduce them right before their comments.
Thank you very much. Do you hear me? Yes? No? Thank you very much. First, I would like to thank you for inviting me. We had a coffee in New York City, when it was 2 years ago? And you told me about this conference, and I was very excited. I'm happy to be here. Also, thank you, Alessandra and Donatello, for organizing this. I mean, it's been, as always, a learning opportunity in two ways. One is, of course, you learn things that you didn't know. And the other one is you learn in terms of how the state of the field, like what people are working on, and maybe you see some trends. So it's great to also you see friends, and you make new friends. So it's great experience. So today I would like to talk about what I address in my recent book, The Wannabe Fascists, which sadly is a topic that we are all living. And this is not how I started. I mean, and I tell my students, about this all the time, because young people, students, they are living in a situation which is very different to the one I lived when I started working on fascism 30 years ago. And my situation was, I lived the first decade of my life under dictatorship. Yesterday, I think Omer said, not everybody live in a war. Well, I mean, I remember the war of '82, the Malvinas-Falklands War. Of course, a distant war in the sense that it was far away from my city, and yet, under the totalitarian propaganda of the dictatorship, I can tell you that as young as I was, I remember a lot. And I wonder how unconsciously some of that stuff is in my mind. I receive a dictatorial education. So when you say that I will stop, I will stop. So that's part of me also. I'm still surprised and gratified to see where, the country I have been living in and I work for the last 20 years, how sometimes within the university, how informal it can be. And it's a surprise, still a surprise, and also a great thing to see, equality. So the question that I'm raising is the question that everybody is thinking about, and as historians, I'm sure you are asked this question as I have been asked this question, which is, what is new with what's going on? And I think I will say that the farther people are from the field of fascist studies, the more they engage in a binary. Either nothing is new or everything is new. So, of course, when you study something, and especially if you're an historian, you say that things are complex because they are. So, I mean, in other fields, and sometimes I'm jealous because journalists will ask you this or that, and the historian will say, very complex. And in other fields, they say, yes, this or that. And that's why often we are not as successfully conveying, what we do, because if we are historians, we will say that. So regarding the question that is Trump a fascist? My own idea of this, and this is what I have been trying to do in my work recently, or more recently, and especially in this book, is that obviously the answer cannot be yes or no. And in Spanish, we have a beautiful word, which is ni. Which is yes and no. In that sense, the question is, rather than a definition or a concept of what it is, and I provide my own term because I have to, but to me that is not as important, I will say, as which are, of course, the continuities, but also the distinctions. And if, of course, as I will argue, the continuities are very strong, then we should be worried as citizens, and we should be studying this as historians. rather than saying, yes, this is fascism, or no, this is not fascism. So there was a reference, and I told Jonathan, you will not be surprised, because I don't see Jonathan presented. Oh, there you are. So we walk, and I told you what I think strongly and very polemically, that in my opinion, I mean, this so-called, and I like that you said so-called, the so-called fascism debate was not a debate at all. I mean, it was, to a big extent, a kind of binary responses from people that do not work on fascism. And I have been very frustrated about that, because in fact, this was not an interesting debate at all, if it was a debate. And the point is that, in my opinion, what was lacking in that debate was actual knowledge of fascist historiography. I mean, can you talk about, seriously, and I'm not a fan of De Felice, but can you talk about fascism without having read De Felice? I mean, I think that would be impossible. Or, I mean, and sadly, it is possible. And thereby, a lot of the participants in the debate are exponents of that, let's say. I mean, I don't want to talk about personal reasons, but I generally think it's a mix of ethnocentrism, laziness, and I guess, opportunism. And as opposed, and probably this is your case as well, as opposed to many of these naysayers, I mean, I have been working on this forever, before Trump was a fact. And then let me return to my point about how our students are in a difficult situation. Because having lived under dictatorship, and when I started working on this, I had the luxury of this thing being in the past. I mean, the Argentine dictatorship was quite connected to fascism in many ways, in explicit ways, in the sense that often they, torturers and even intellectuals and generals will say, we identify with Hitler and we are trying to continue that legacy in a different way. I mean, as I wrote in one of my books on the dirty war, sometimes they will torture people and they will say, especially to Jewish victims, for example, in Argentina, they will say, the Nazis lost, but we will win. And your ancestors, I mean, they won, but you will be defeated. And when you read the witnesses from those, I don't talk about transhistorical in the way of something being out of history, but in terms of like a kind of appropriation of transhistorical memories by perpetrators and their attempt to impose those memories into perpetrators. I mean, that is an interesting phenomenon, and it happens. So in a way, it's very hard not to analyze, for example, the Argentine dictatorship without fascism, insofar as the perpetrators identify with the legacy of fascism, and they believe they were, they were continuing that fight. In that context, as I said, I had the luxury of this was the past. As every historian at the time, and probably forever, when people outside the academy asked me at that time when I was a student, why are you interested in this? I would say, well, we study history to understand the present, which is true, but also is perhaps also more, whimsically, we also like the past. We like studying the past, but we make the connection. And then I will add, as we always do, because hopefully, the future will not be like this, and the more understanding of the past, the future will be different. This is not the case for our students and for us now, but it's a totally different thing, like starting to work on these issues when they seem to be, resurrecting or being reformulated in the recent past, in the present, and I guess the future, because we don't talk about the future, but in a few, at least in the US, in a few days, there is the return of some of this stuff to power. Now, my dismissal of this so-called debate relates to something that we teach our students, which is, before you say something, read the bibliography. And that is, the beauty of this conference, especially, because in the same way, like, you need to read Mosse, even if you don't agree with Mosse. He's a key historian for the history of fascism. And I like about the conference that we had to go back to a text. And I was wondering a lot about that, because, of course, there are things that are dated, and many colleagues mention them, and I agree. And there are in a way, this is a history of history, or a historiographical exercises. But in a great author such as Mosse, also there are things that that remain as part of questions that we ask and so on. And I have noticed by the way that there is, this is educated guess, that Mosse is not as important as he was when I started. In fact, like my first book was, I think, really influenced by Mosse, which at the time, as I said, we were reading in Italian translations. But I think there is a need to return to this. And I was wondering, I didn't read the entire thing, but when I was reading this, a lot of things that we can go back to in a way. But I in terms of my own topic, I had to be critical, because there is a moment in the conversation when there is an attempt to think the connection between the what was then the recent past of fascism vis-a-vis the present, and there is a discussion about Perón. I don't know if somebody remembers this part, but I was stuck because there are two participants, an expert on Italy and a Spaniard, that talk about Perón. At one point, Gordon Craig says, "Let me return to Perón." I'm silent from Mosse, which is interesting because probably, I never met him, but I assume he was a humble person and he didn't know much about Perón, so probably he didn't say anything. And in fact, what Juan Lin says about Perón is kind of incorrect. And perhaps Mosse was cautious about it. And this is a topic that I would like to address. How am I with time? Because I'm okay. So far. So we'll see. So because at that time, and I mentioned Gino Germani before, and Professor Moro wrote an essay recently about the centrality of Gino Germani's thought to the Felice thought, which is to say, there is a connection. I would like to know more about that, regarding Mosse. But, Gino Germani was an interesting character because, and a scholar, of course, because he was briefly imprisoned in fascist Italy. He was an Italian young person and young scholar. And so this guy, he's in prison, he leaves Italy, he's an anti-fascist, he goes to Buenos Aires, and sooner than later he has Perón. So the university is no longer viable. He's really, he creates this, or he's part of a kind of resistance. Yes, I don't know why there is this idea that resistance is wrong when there is authoritarianism. And by the way, in the so-called debate, there are millionaires that from their townhouses in Brooklyn, they criticize people that are concerned about rights and so on. But let me go back to Germani. So he was part of a resistance against, the authoritarianism going on in the university. If you are into Latin American literature, I will recommend the novel The Exam by Cortázar, in which he talks about the context of a university that is memory-based and is very authoritarian and canonic, and it's not a place for thinking, and certainly not a place for criticizing authoritarianism. When the Perón government is over, Germani will found the career of sociology in Buenos Aires. In Argentina, at the time, that was the first and a kind of key moment in Latin America, in Latin America's history of social sciences. Eventually, he will go to Harvard, and eventually he will return to Italy. But Germani was, for me and for many others in Latin America, was very important because he was smart enough to recognize that there was something different between the new authoritarianism that Perón represented. And unlike the fascism seminar, Perón was not a dictator. So this is a key issue. Yes, there was mass appeal, there was working class support. Perón had been a fascist. He actually was the strong man in a dictatorship. But after 45, he realizes that, or, he thinks that there is a need for a new kind of politics, and he calls for elections, which he wins. And this is a start of, my recent work, because what I see, first, I work on fascism. At some point, on a more biographical note, if you allow me to present the subject position of this historian, in this case myself, at some point, my dissertation was about the connections between Italian and Argentine fascism. I got tenure out of that. Eventually that secured my job. And so, I don't know, in Italy, I think the Argentine cartoon Mafalda is very well known. I mean, in other places, it is very well known. And there is a moment in Mafalda, I mean, this is a young girl, that she visits the house of Libertà, who is a friend whose parents are scholars, but really without a job. They are translators, they are intellectuals, they don't have a job. And at some point, Libertà opens the fridge. And she says, you know, this chicken, she's very proud that she will eat chicken. This chicken, Sartre gave this chicken to us. And then she explains that the mom translated Sartre and now they have money to eat chicken. So my book was sort of that, like I take it also in that way. So, because I mean, incidentally, I mean, and again, this is interesting in terms of how archives shape our research, because I thought I was going to do a comparative research between Argentina and Italy. I came, especially here, and Roberta was, like, we were sometimes sitting in the same desk in the Archivio Centrale dello Stato. I found materials that allowed me to write about the connections. I realized that at that time there was, you know, something called transnational history going on. I wrote a book. It became the first monograph on fascism and transnational history. Now, since the chicken was ready to eat, I guess, at that time I decided, when the book was published in 2010, I decided I was not going to work on transnational history and I would switch to do national history. So, I mean, they were inviting me at that time to the transnational history conference, and I would say, no, I'm working on something different now. Maybe not a great career move, but that's what I wanted to do. And because, the way I started working on fascism was that in Argentina, I, like everybody else, I guess, I was not original. I wanted to work on the Argentine dictatorship. But in the 1990s, the Argentine dictatorship, there were not many archives. I mean, there was, it was quite recent. And my advisors, especially my advisor, he said, there is no way I will allow you to write on this. So, and after a long conversation, I convinced him that he will allow me to write on the first dictatorship of 1930. So I said, okay, this is my way. And this is how I started working on fascism. Once I published my transnational history book, I said, well, I guess now I can do whatever I want. And I said, okay, I will write a book about the Argentine dictatorship. This is why I became an historian. I want to write that book. And eventually it became a history of the fascist idea in Argentina, leading to what I see as the kind of objective, actually, very much influenced by Mosse, making things tangible, making like a kind of switch between ideology and practice, that in the torture chambers, again, like the history of Argentine fascism became personified in the bodies of the victim. Anyway, so I published that book, and in that book, I saw the polemic part. I already talked about, in that book, about the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, very reactionary figure that had been, had a role in the Argentine dictatorship. I mentioned this guy by name. Now he's called Francesco, and he's the Pope. But I thought that was going to be the polemic chapter. He also changed, by the way. But in the 1970s, he was quite linked to fascism, and he had a very dubious role in the dictatorship. I thought that was going to be the polemic part. And in fact, like one day when he became the Pope, by the way, like the New York Times called me and said, what do you have to say about the Pope? I said, okay, he's related to fascism. I said a lot of things, and they published them. And then the Pope changed. So historians, we never know exactly. Now he's a progressive figure, which he is, by the way. I mean, in the European context, well, it's a discussion, but in a way he is. Like, more than others at least. Anyway, he came to the US in the first presidential election of Trumpism, and he defended migrants. Anyway, whatever. So I thought that was going to be the polemic chapter. It wasn't. So I was explaining the history of clerical fascism in Argentina. That wasn't the polemic chapter in Argentina. The polemic chapter of my book was the one I wrote on Peronism. And in a way, what I said is ni. I said the title of that chapter was Peronism between fascism and populism. And I tried to explain why this was not fascism, that it was influenced by it, and it was a historical point, not a morphological one. So what happened to Perón after 45, 46, 47? I mean, what's going on here? And that's why I started a new career, like, in populism studies. And I have been working on that field for a long time now. So after that, I published another book which was called From Fascism to Populism in History, which is a kind of precedent for my current book. That book I finished briefly before Trump was elected. And in that book, again, showing that historians, I don't know, maybe that's not your case, but I don't think we are that great in predicting the future. In the manuscript, I talk about how I saw that Trumpism already represented something new in the history of populism, a sort of returning to some elements which were more typical of the fascists. And I actually delighted in putting in his failed bid for the presidency, Donald Trump. So I was explaining the example from the campaign. And my editor at California Press, she said, why don't we wait until the election? And we did. And after a brief period of depression and melancholia, I decided to rewrite the book. But it's not the hypothesis, but rather radicalize the point that, this is the, if Perón in Argentina had been the first populist in history, like it seemed that populism was at its height by reaching, the most powerful country in the world. And in that book, I explore, the similarities between fascism and populism, but also the differences. The argument in that book, which I project into this one, but also here, I'm sort of, taking account of new things, which for me are important. And I told Enzo, who is my friend for decades, basically, after he finished his talk, I talked about him that I disagree about the fact that, the coup d'etats in the US and Brazil are an exception. For me, Europe is the exception for now. I mean, the fact that in the two biggest democracies in the Western Hemisphere, you have two coup d'etats. I mean, to me, this is not an exception. This is a major issue, and that's why I decided to write this book. Because let me go back to populism and how much time I have. 20 minutes. Oh, I'm rich in time. So to me, I will tell you basically what I found like once I switched to populist studies. I had the background of fascist studies, which in populism studies is not really something that most scholars do. In fact, in populism studies, as I was shocked to find there are not many historians. Historians sometimes do not gravitate towards the category or do not engage in these conceptual discussions. And in the social sciences, especially political science and sociology, scholars that work on populism, do not think history or historians are that important. So it's our fault because we don't participate, but also there is this bias that historians basically provide data for them to present great hypotheses. You can understand how enraged I was about reading this, even from the best scholars in the fields, which I respect. For example, someone like Rosan Balón, for example, who says Latin American populism and European populism are different because they are different. And this goes back to fascism studies when some say, Latin America or Asia are different to Europe. And look, I'm a Latin Americanist. I read a lot of European historiography. Did you read about Latin America, or you just are, kind of catapulting yourself or erecting yourself into a big monument which is rooted in stereotypes and even discrimination? And my best example of this, by the way, is Stanley Payne, who was mentioned before, who basically explains that fascism cannot exist in Latin America because of, and I will mention a couple of ones, high levels of illiteracy, machismo, something that obviously never happened in fascist Italy, and my favorite, multiracial societies. So when you have all that, you cannot have fascism. Unless you think that German Jews were not truly German, that was a multiracial society as I see it. So basically, this idea that you cannot study the world because the world is different, but you are lazy, and you don't have, and some books are in English, by the way. It's not that you have to read other languages, and, we read you, you don't read us, and it's your loss in a way. Then, the idea in other books on populism, Perón appears as a dictator, another stereotype that was presented in the fascist seminar discussion. But what happened to Perón is very interesting, not because he is the founder of a new thing, and I'm Argentine, and if you visit Latin America, you will know about the stereotypes about Argentines, which they believe they are the center of the world. Many of them do that, including the current president of Argentina, who is a living stereotype. But the stereotypes are also limited. And my point is not really the centrality of Argentina or Argentine-centric kind of thing, but rather explaining Latin American history as the first site where people that had been fascists or fellow travelers, as António Costa Pinto in his work highlighted the centrality of this category, that when we think about fascism in the interwar years and the war years, we should not only think about the fascists that maybe we all agree are fascists, but rather of a constellation of right-wingers and fellow travelers and dictatorships which were close to fascists or had fascists, but were not necessarily fascist. So when we think about this, we should think about the rejection of equality, liberalism, constitutional democracy as something that united them. And of course, hatred for a lot of things that were conceived or were actually different. Now, in that context, many of these people in Latin America, and I'm thinking about Getulio Vargas, a dictator, Juan Perón, a strongman in a dictatorship, and then, in Bolivia, people that were collaborating with a fascist dictator. The same you could say about a coalition, similar coalition in Venezuela, and other places, also failed projects in Colombia and Peru. But there is something going on in Latin America, and Perón is the first, by 1 year or 2. So my point is not really about, this being the kind of thing that shapes all others, but rather to see patterns in Latin American history, which in a way were kind of a antecedent for something that eventually went on in other places. And there are reasons for that, which I explain in my work. I can engage in the Q&A, why Latin America first, and then others. But what happens is that people that had been fascists or fellow travelers or dictators, somehow, and this is something that we should remember, sorry for being normative on this, but this is about power. Like when we study fascism, it's not only about futurismo or aesthetics, but the connection between all that and power. So these people are politicians, and they want power. And to the extent that they don't want that, they fail. And in a way, they become less interesting, perhaps more interesting intellectually, but less interesting politically. Perón realizes that fascism, as great as he thought it was, cannot be after the war. He actually had visited Italy and Germany in the later years, by the way, not the early fascism, but the late, fascism, and he liked it a lot. But then he says, in a new world, what is needed is not National Socialism, but Socialismo Nacional, which, anyway, a play of words. And he said, my dear, something like, my dear Duce, it was great, it will not happen again. He even invents a meeting in Palazzo Venezia between himself and Mussolini. It's an invention because he talks about things that are, if you know Mussolini, I doubt that was the case, highly doubt that. According to Perón, Mussolini received him, and Perón explained the war to him, and Mussolini was listening for half an hour, apparently, and then they say bye-bye. But this symbolic passing of the baton was very important to Perón, in the sense that he thought that it was important to keep the fight against what he called, as Mussolini had done, demoliberalismo, or democratic liberalism, in order to fight the common enemies of fascism, which were like capitalism and socialism, or the US and the Soviet Union. So this kind of third way, what he called actually la tercera posición, the third position, was something that many fascists regarded as lost, and in Latin America first, they tried to resurrect. And in a way, if you think about a key element in fascism, and how I'm doing with time? Oh my God, okay, now I'm not reaching time, so I will finish very soon. So he thought that, that democracy, or at least electoral democracy, was the way of the future, that it provided legitimacy, And many others follow. And in fact, if fascism, in the most famous cases, including the one in this country, destroyed democracy from within in order to create a dictatorship from above, Perón did the opposite. Perón was a dictator who called for elections and created a democracy from above. And that democracy, of course, carried on a lot of authoritarian elements, but it rejected four elements. And I talk about fascism, populism as a reformulation. Populism in power, by the way. I'm not talking about things that happened before, but the first time populism comes to power as a kind of system of government or a style or whatever you want to call it. I can talk more about that in the Q&A. But he rejected practically and sometimes explicitly 4 elements of fascism, which in my opinion, are central to fascism. So in this book, and I will finish in 4 minutes. In this book, it has 4 chapters, and each chapter is about one of these 4 pillars of fascism. Which this is not a definition of fascism, but the 4 pillars are things that differentiate fascism from populism. I mean, 20th century populism was different to fascism because fascism presented this extreme idealization of violence with practical implications and a militarization of politics, 1 chapter. The other one is on propaganda and lies. I wrote a book about that, but I returned to this issue for this book. Propaganda and lies, which there is a specific fascist way about creating alternative realities and changing the world according to those realities. Demonization, and specifically xenophobia, going after minority groups, either because they are different or they are conceived as different, and that having practical implications, going after them, killing them, deporting them, torturing them, killing them, and finally, dictatorship. Now, those for me in my previous book were the key distinctions, and I maybe have 2 minutes now? Okay, so, but what I see in the current, just to return to the knee answer, in Trumpism, Bolsonarism, Modi in India and other places, including in Europe, is a return by populists to elements which were earlier rejected by earlier populists. And these elements are the 4 that I just mentioned. And of course, this return doesn't mean the same levels, the same quantitative or qualitative situation vis-a-vis, let's say, violence in fascism or dictatorship in fascism. But we see something which was anathema to other populists. And Perón, for example, or Vargas will be explicit about this, how problematic violence or racism are. I mean, Perón in private was a racist, but that didn't matter to him. The point is how you gain votes. And he said, if you're a fascist, you lose votes. And now there is a different thinking. And when Trump won, in the first one, the New York Times asked him, in a very wrong understanding of what's going on, because they were, as we see now again, that we are falling under that trap, believing that somehow there will be some form of normalization. And they asked Trump, do you think after you won, that now you will engage in more dialogue and less hate? And Trump said, why? I won. So this is the way these politics are. And so in these 4 chapters, I explore these 3 different moments in these histories. Each chapter deals with classic fascism, classic populism, and what I call the new wannabe fascists, which for me are people that are approaching or returning to key elements of fascism without being fully fascist. I don't know whether we'll become fully fascist. I'm an historian. I don't predict the future. But to me, this is really bad enough. And this is my conclusion. Thank you.